Hi, I'm Joe Aldy. I'm a member of the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it is my honor to welcome you to this virtual press conference today on climate policy under the Trump administration. I'm pleased to be joined by three Harvard University colleagues for today's event. We have Jody Freeman, professor at Harvard Law School. She's the director of the Environmental and Energy Law program at the law school, and she served as counselor for energy and climate change in the White House in 2009 and 2010. We have John Holdren, a colleague of mine on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's the co-director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and he served as the president's science advisor and director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy over 2009 to 2017. And we have Mary Rice, a member of the faculties of both the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Medical School. She serves as the director of the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment, also known as Sea Change, at the Harvard Chan School, and is the director of the Institute for Lung Health at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Our event today is sponsored by the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard University. The mission of the Salata Institute is to develop and promote durable, effective, and equitable solutions to the climate change challenges confronting humanity. One of our strategies for delivering on this mission is to convene colleagues from across the university with expertise in an array of disciplines and, importantly, extensive engagement with and participation in the world of practice to develop ideas, insights, and approaches for mitigating the risk of a changing climate. Today, we bring together a legal scholar, a physicist, a pulmonary physician, and an economist to assess the Trump administration's actions to date and to preview potential steps in the future they may undertake in addressing climate policy. I will first go to each of my colleagues for some brief remarks. We'll go in order that I introduce them, to Jody, and John, and Mary, and then I will make some remarks. And then we will open it up to questions. If you have a question for us, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. And with that, Jody, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. And a word of empathy first, which is you have a lot to cover. And I personally am really grateful to the press, to the media for doing such a great job covering a torrent of events we've been witnessing. I want to provide some framing for you and that I hope will be useful for all of us as we comment. And it really boils down to this for me. There are 5 pillars in my thinking for how we approach climate policy in the United States. The first I think of as the international context, international negotiations, and the U.S. role in it. Secondly, the domestic approach we take to federal regulation of greenhouse gases and state regulation of greenhouse gases and associated clean energy policies. So that's the regulatory prong. The third prong, I would call it industrial policy, what Congress embarked on to invest in alternatives to fossil energy and to help create a cleaner set of modes for transportation and power and so on. And the fourth prong, I would say, is science and research on climate, which we will be addressing. And the fifth and final prong is private sector efforts to address climate risks and supply alternatives. Those 5 prongs, international negotiations, domestic regulation, industrial policy, science and research, and the private sector's role are all under attack by the Trump administration. And so it's important to keep that sort of cumulative set of things in mind when you cover the individual pieces of policy as it unfolds. I'll just say a couple words about the latest round of executive orders. In April, there was a set of new executive orders signed by the president doing really 3 things. These orders instructed the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, to investigate state climate and clean energy policies and to try to stop them if the administration felt that they were at odds with its preferences for energy dominance. The second thing the EOs did was to instruct agencies like FERC to use their emergency authorities to take a variety of measures that in the end amount to propping up coal-fired power. And the third key thing this round of executive orders did was to direct the agencies to scour their regulations, environmental rules, climate rules, that the administration might view as now unlawful going forward. So long-standing rules that the administration now might decide are no longer legal on its reading of a set of Supreme Court cases, and an instruction to these agencies to unilaterally and summarily rescind these rules without going through the normal notice and comment legal process. So those are three key things about the new orders to track. And I want to harken back to the first round of executive orders in January, the first week of the administration, because the consequences of those initial orders are also unfolding. And the highlights of those consequences are the endangerment finding that the president, the White House directed the Environmental Protection Agency to reconsider. That process is now underway. That's a very serious process, because if the administration were to rescind the endangerment finding under the Clean Air Act, they would knock out the scientific finding that provides the legal basis for issuing any rules at all to control climate pollution. The second thing to track that is a consequence of the first executive orders in January is the California waiver, which is the special authority California gets under the Clean Air Act once it applies to the EPA, to be given power separately to set its own transportation standards, car and truck standards for vehicle emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions. That waiver power is very important because California has been a bulwark, a backup really, to keep spurring progress in the transportation sector. And that waiver, a set of waivers, is now under consideration in Congress under the Congressional Review Act process, which allows Congress to essentially cancel rules that have already been adopted by a prior administration. The waivers have never been treated as rules before, and it looks like they're now being treated that way by the Zeldin EPA, and the House has already voted to disapprove them. We're waiting to see if the Senate will do so and contradict its own Senate parliamentarian, which would be something quite important to see if it happened. And finally, what I want to mention is to track, that everyone is tracking, and I know you're tracking, is grants and personnel. So the administration early on, again, in its earliest executive orders, ordered the freezing of a variety of federal grants, and now the landscape is mixed. Courts have stopped some of that freezing and allowed certain grants to be dispersed, and other very significant amount of funding under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund remains frozen. And that has really serious consequences for the grantees and the private sector partners that were going to use these billions of dollars in funding to get decarbonization and efficiency and building decarb projects and clean transportation projects and clean school buses and all the rest up and running. That freezing has serious implications for whether industrial policy will be seen to be successful over time. And finally, the major personnel moves, which we're going to have others reflect on, I'm sure, at EPA and other agencies, that have the potential to have very long-term consequences because of the erosion of expertise and career civil servants politicized into being ultimately non-expert non-expert servants of the administration. So I think that those things are also unfolding, and the full consequences aren't yet visible. I'll say one last thing and then leave it. People have asked about the long-term stability of this change that is being wrought by the administration. I think some of these policies will be reversible, others will be harder to reverse, and I'm happy to take questions on that. Executive orders are not law. The normal rule is what a president can do with the stroke of the pen, the next president can undo with the stroke of the pen. But that's not exactly the right way to think about this administration, which is doing so much so fast, much of which is clearly unlawful, that they're demanding, they're daring the courts to stop them, and they're having us chase them around. And by the time the law catches up with them, the status quo is significantly shifted. So reversibility for some things will be much harder. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Jody. Let me turn it over next to John.
Thanks very much, Joe. Let me start with a couple of words about what science tells us about the climate change issue. What we know without any doubt whatsoever is that climate change is an immense challenge, both for the United States and for the world. The only other global dangers that even compare are nuclear weapons and pandemic disease. Human-caused disruption of the global climate is already producing serious harm to economies, to ecosystems, to human health and safety, and even to international security. But Trump has been savaging U.S. capacity to understand and respond to the climate menace. He's been slashing budgets and staff, eliminating programs right and left in what had been one of the world's two most comprehensive efforts addressing the climate challenge alongside China's efforts. Trump's cuts are not only devastating U.S. climate research and policy engagement inside the federal government at NOAA, NASA, NSF, and so on through the list, the cuts are also disrupting climate science, technology development, and education efforts that depend on federal funding at colleges, universities, state and local governments, NGOs, and businesses across the country. Let me give just a couple examples of the damage that the Trump-Musk cabal is doing at NOAA and NASA and at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I'll leave it to Mary to talk about EPA and Health and Human Services. First of all, NOAA. NOAA has been the most important center of climate change research, monitoring, and education in the federal government. Early in the administration, the Trump-Musk team dismissed more than 10% of the NOAA staff, started cutting back its climate monitoring and database operations, and announced the intention to dismantle NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, one of the world's most important producers and funders of climate science. Trump's budget for FY 2026 would indeed dismantle that office if approved by the Congress, and it would also hobble early warning systems for natural disasters and demolish climate science education for students in kindergarten through high school. NASA's Earth science programs are the major source of satellite and aircraft-based observations of the planet's land and vegetation, oceans, and ice, information that is essential to tracking climate change impacts and designing adaptation strategies. Having fired NASA's chief scientist and her staff in March, and by the way, the chief scientist was a climate scientist, Trump's FY 2026 budget then called in May for a 50% cut to NASA's Earth Science Division. The U.S. Global Change Research Program is a 15-agency consortium under the National Science and Technology Council, which coordinates federal government efforts on global change research, most importantly, research on climate change. At the end of April, the Trump administration terminated the consortium's quadrennial assessment of climate change impacts on the United States, did so in midstream of that study. The assessments, which previously were produced in every administration since Clinton's, focused on disaggregating climate change impacts by region and by sector. They've provided indispensable guidance to states, communities, and businesses on specific needs for climate change adaptation. Whether the U.S. Global Change Research Program itself will survive is doubtful. With that, let me turn it over to Mary.
Great, thanks, John. Mary.
Thank you, John and Joe. Thank you all so much for joining this call today and covering these very important issues. As Joe mentioned, I'm a lung doctor, I'm an environmental health researcher, and among the dizzying list of rollbacks, one of particular concern because of the far-reaching health consequences is the downsizing of the EPA's main science division, which employs about 1,500 research professionals whose work underpins environmental health protections, including air quality and climate policy for the entire country. This office plays a critical role in studying how people are exposed to climate-driven hazards like extreme heat and air pollutants like ozone smog and wildfire smoke, and then how those pollutants and exposures affect the heart and the lung and the brain. And some of those exposure studies done in that office and the synthesis of all of the best available research by that science branch is what provides the EPA policy branch the evidence that it needs to set health-based air quality and greenhouse gas emissions policies in order to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. And historically, it's these health-based policies for clean air that have yielded enormous benefits. I mean, looking back, at least 10 to 1, by many estimates, greater than 31 to 1 benefit to cost ratio due to improved US life expectancy, avoided heart attacks and asthma attacks, among other benefits. Almost all of the climate-related rules that are at risk of being undone, the motor vehicle emission standards, rules on greenhouse gas emissions and mercury and air toxics from power plants, they are all based on an assessment of harm to human health. And so this move to gut the core scientific capacity of our federal government to protect public health from pollution and from climate change leaves climate and air quality decisions more vulnerable to political pressure, less grounded in science, and that puts public health at serious risk. Secondly, I'm very concerned about the sweeping cancellation, freezing, and uncertainty around federal funding for climate and health research and community-led climate health programs. Jody mentioned some of this. Billions of dollars of EPA funding was distributed to low-income communities under the Inflation Reduction Act to improve their resilience against the health effects of climate change and air pollution. And that is now canceled or frozen. Initiatives, just to give you some examples of the kinds of initiatives that have been disrupted, it's things like wildfire smoke protection in the Western US, air purifier distribution programs in low-income communities, city programs to reduce the health effects of heat and air pollution from trucks. And in just the past few days, the EPA has canceled hundreds of research grants to universities, to scientists. Almost the entire EPA research health research portfolio, I believe, has been canceled in just the last few days. And to give you one example, one of my colleagues, the Deputy Director of Sea Change, Dr. Nori Sarma, she had a project that was developing interactive dashboards for communities to visualize their overlapping health risks of heat and air pollution and flooding and chemicals, information that would be very helpful for decision making. And that work has been halted. That means focus groups were left unfinished. Trainees who are funded by the research are now suddenly unfunded, don't know what to do next. And really importantly, years of trust that has taken a long time to build up with those community partners is now at risk. At the NIH, the future of funding for climate and health research is uncertain. There appears to be a shift to focus more on short-term disasters like wildfires and heat waves, but without considering underlying climate drivers. And this change may sideline really important research on the full scope of the health consequences of greenhouse gas emissions and, importantly, potential reductions that could save lives. So with climate and health research shutting down at the US EPA and at universities around the country due to lack of funding, our ability to evaluate emerging health threats, including the toxicity of wildfire smoke to human health, and new infectious disease threats will likely be severely compromised. And shutting down this research undermines our ability as a society to protect the health of Americans of all ages. And when science is silenced, lives are lost. I look forward to your questions. Joe.
Thank you, Mary. Let me close this sort of opening segment of our press conference with a few remarks of my own, and then we'll go to questions from you. So again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In my assessment of the first 4 months, as well as how I look forward to likely implications of Trump administration actions and policy with respect to climate change, there's 4 key points that I'd like to emphasize. First and foremost, I think, is a defining characteristic of their actions, which is actually not about policy, but about creating uncertainty about policy. That is this policy uncertainty, which actually has a very chilling effect on decisions for investment and long-term strategy by the private sector. By creating uncertainty about policy, whether it's on tariffs, whether it's on tax policy in the context of the current debate in Congress, whether it's with respect to regulatory policy and walking back previous administrations' regulations, whether it's in how we administer current rules that govern how we cite and permit and review energy projects, this kind of policy uncertainty is raising the cost of undertaking investment. It's slowing efforts that the private sector would undertake otherwise to develop and deploy clean energy technologies. And overall, what it means is just that we have less new investment in energy. It risks having higher energy prices for us. It means we see less deployment of clean energy and renewable energy that would lower the emissions of both local air pollutants and carbon dioxide that contribute to climate change. But I want to stress this isn't just about clean energy. This kind of policy uncertainty, especially in the context of this administration's approach to tariffs, has actually been bad for investment in conventional energy, in oil and gas development. We've seen both the direct effect of tariffs, which would raise the costs of many of the key inputs, like the steel piping that go into wells at oil and gas fields. That's making it more expensive to drill. But then the indirect effect of the tariffs, the prospect that we will see slower economic growth. It's actually caused the price of oil in our markets to fall about 25% since Trump came into office. That's not a reflection of any kind of clever policy. That's a reflection of a weaker economic outlook and expectations of lower demand for energy in the future. As a result, I think we will see overall less investment in both clean energy and oil and gas in the near future, reflecting the kind of uncertainty that this administration has actually brought to the energy sector and to our economic activity. The second point I'd like to address is this administration's approach that it can best be described as unilateralism with respect to how it engages other countries. We know from day one of this administration that they walked away from the Paris Agreement, the UN Climate Change Agreement. But in general, they have been less engaged. They have boycotted several international venues, such as a G20 meeting at the minister level. But I find it actually to be quite puzzling as a strategy for advancing the US interests, regardless of how you define US interests. We see other major fossil fuel producers around the world, Russia or Saudi Arabia, they engage quite actively in UN climate change negotiations convened through the Paris Agreement. They engage quite actively on energy and climate issues when they're brought to the G20 forum. They do this because they're trying to represent their interest. It's hard to represent your interest when you're not in the room. We know from a wide array of experiences that US deployment of soft power often can be critical in advancing our interests, and it's important for us to take advantage of existing institutions and to craft new institutions that enable the US to advance its interest. So unilaterally throwing away some of the key tools of international relations doesn't make it any easier for the US government to achieve its goals. The third point I'd like to emphasize, and this reflects several points that my colleagues have already made, is that I think we are seeing the evolution towards a low information government. This government is actually making concerted efforts to reduce the amount of data available and to reduce the generation of new data and evidence by both government scientists as well as scientists who are supported through government funding that are critical for us to understand the impacts of not just a changing climate, but how climate change manifests in the weather we realize on a day-to-day basis. That kind of information helps us better understand our exposure to natural disaster risk, whether it's hurricane season in the Atlantic this year and in the Gulf, whether it's trying to better understand the potential risk of droughts exacerbating forest fires out west, how to think about the prospects of heat stress from long heat waves this summer. We have less information available that's being compiled by the government and less information being shared that's important for both households and businesses to act so that we can reduce our exposure and mitigate the risk we face from these natural disaster risk. I think this is important both for improving our public health, but important in how some of our key markets function. A lot of what we see, for example, in insurance markets draws on data that has originally been collected and organized and analyzed by the US government and by scientists supported by the US government. We already know that with an increasing array of natural disaster risk, the price of insurance, basically the cost of living, when we think about what we have to do to support living in our homes in certain parts of the country, like in California, like in the Gulf states that are at risk of storms, those costs are increasing significantly. If we have less information for the insurance market to build on, we're going to see some companies leave areas that they think are high risk, but they don't have the evidence available to really assess and identify those risks. We're going to then see, I think, the cost of living as evident through our insurance premiums increase all the more because of this pursuit of a low information approach to government. The final point I'd like to make is that implementing policy is hard work. I know this, having worked in the past in the government with both Jody and John, that to be effective in advancing your policy in the federal government, it's critical to have a dedicated team of public servants who have the expertise and are trained in the sciences and law and public policy and public health and engineering and more. You need them to be able to understand what Congress passes, to understand what the White House may say we want to do, but then to be able to work effectively in implementing that so that you can actually advance your goals. As we have seen the kind of gutting of the federal workforce, that means these dedicated public servants aren't there to do their work on behalf of the American public. And so whether it is a goal to advance decarbonization, as we saw in the previous administration, or the claim in this administration have a goal of energy dominance, if you really want to make progress and be effective, we need a talented civil service. And so that is a concern that I see with the kind of changes that have been occurring throughout the federal government, is that regardless of what one wants to do, if it's anything more than just disruption to kind of sustain the status quo, it's hard to make progress affirmatively on goals in service of the American public. Now, with that, I want to turn to questions that you have. I want to first go to Jody with a question. So one thing is, we heard a little bit, and you referenced this in the beginning, about the kind of executive orders. We saw a lot of executive orders. The executive orders raise questions about what the president can say, I want to do this, and it just happens automatically. But there's some things where it triggers processes, but there's also others where it seems like, wait, can the president do that? Because it seems contrary to what Congress has done. So help us understand a little bit about both the legal import of the executive order, what then is more legally binding that may be the result of, say, agency actions in response to an executive order, and how might we think about these cases where the actions under executive orders are triggering legal challenges, in part because they appear to be inconsistent with current statutory authorities.
Yeah. So here's the way I talk about executive orders, whether I'm teaching my administrative law class or out in the world. Executive orders are really like memos from the CEO to business units. That's how I think about them. They announce things, they direct agencies as if they were business units to do things. In and of themselves, many executive orders, especially in climate and energy matters that have to do with things in our space, don't self-execute. They don't accomplish something on their own. Now, there are some instances where they might. For example, the direction to suspend funding was fairly immediate in its impact. The agencies did have to do something, but they did it immediately. And so there wasn't a process of notice and comment rulemaking or something. But for the most part, executive orders are directing agencies to do things. All the executive orders that a president signs have a very important phrase in them, with those of us who worked in government know, which is to the extent permitted by law. Executive orders don't purport to be law. They're directions from the president, and they have to be consistent with congressional statutes. And if they violate those statutes, it's the executive order that yields. The problem here, folks, is that this isn't normal. You know, no president that I know of in history, in contemporary history that I'm aware of, has ever issued executive orders that are so reckless in their disregard of legal limits and are willing to roll the dice or actually intentionally violate legal requirements and then say, chase us around and sue us to stop us. So while the executive orders don't necessarily do anything right away, they are directing agencies to do things in a much faster fashion without regard for normal legal process. And those things can happen quite quickly. And then you have to wind up suing the government to stop them. So it's the extent of the risk-taking, the willingness to flout existing law that's so troubling here about these executive orders, not to mention their tone and tenor, which is unprecedentedly ideological, hostile, aggressive, and so on. Never seen executive orders like this, but that's rhetoric, and it doesn't really count in law. The other thing I just say to Joe's question is, at every step of execution, when an agency says, oh, the president told me to use emergency powers in order to help the coal industry, at every step of that process, there's a possibility of challenging what the agency does. So it's a wait and see situation where you wait to see what EPA is going to do, or the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, and then the groups or states that want to challenge that action, they do that. That's when the litigation typically happens.
Right, thanks. I will emphasize all this kind of process and these different points where we may have a legal challenge. It creates this kind of uncertainty that if you are a private firm whose investment or strategy is affected by the outcome of this, it causes you to pause. It causes you to play wait and see. And if part of your agenda is to support the incumbent fossil fuel energy companies and to slow down decarbonization, just having this process that takes time, even if you're not actually implementing and fully executing new policy, that process ends up having a similar kind of effect as one that actually formally institutionalized new policy. John, let me turn to you next. In your job when you were science advisor, you did a lot of work actually engaging with scientists from around the world that builds on a long career where you often partnered with scientists around the world. One question we have is trying to understand the implications for the United States and the potential cost for the US withdrawing from international scientific collaborations, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Yeah, I would add to the international collaborations at risk, international engagement with the whole UN framework on climate change process, bilateral cooperation with other countries on developing advanced mitigation and adaptation technologies, bilateral and multilateral assistance to countries in need of help with both mitigation and adaptation. When the United States withdraws from all of these kinds of international engagements, it loses international credibility and influence. It concedes leadership in this important space to China and others, and it slows progress on this big global problem that should matter to everybody. And we need to understand how difficult, slow, and costly reversing these kinds of cuts will be. The teams cannot be quickly remobilized and brought up to speed. Talent lost to other countries and other pursuits often cannot be reclaimed at all. And the time lost from advancing solutions is gone forever. And all of this runs the risk of climate change growing faster than it otherwise would have, possibly passing catastrophic tipping points.
Thank you, John. Mary, you mentioned some about the challenges we're facing as the funding for health research has been cut. One question that comes up in this context, but also in others, is the potential role that private philanthropy might play in filling the gap. What do you see as the sort of the potential in public health for philanthropy to fill in for these gaps with reductions in government funding for research?
Well, no doubt, I think there's a great need for philanthropic support to fill some of these gaps. We've already noted so many different delays and so much uncertainty about what can be funded. And I think there's a great role that philanthropy could play to try to support research going forward, testing solutions for patients and communities against climate-related hazards as these grants are being canceled. At my own center at Sea Change, for example, we have several studies. We have an air purifier trial for people with lung disease. And we have a multi-site study on cooling solutions for low resource communities. That's all subject to federal funding freezes. And we're scaling up efforts to secure philanthropic support. But I think it's really important to note here that most foundations fund at a much, much smaller scale. Typical grants from philanthropic organizations are tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars per grant. That really can't match the scope, the continuity, the reach of federal research programs funded from EPA, NIH, NSF. And medical research, it's really costly. That's absolutely true, but the US experience has shown that it pays off in terms of medical discovery that leads to disease cures and disease prevention, which is really important when we think about climate hazards.
Thanks. Jody, let me go back to you. The Supreme Court is going to take up the birthright citizenship ban tomorrow.
Yeah.
And one of the issues at play here is whether the Supreme Court could decide to curb the use of nationwide injunctions that come from a more junior judge.
Yeah, this is a bit, yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of effect might this have in the context of climate and energy related lawsuits
Right.
in the future? Would it make it harder for environmentalists to challenge administration efforts?
Right. So this is a very nerdy, great question. This case reaching the court isn't really centrally about the question of the constitutionality of ending birthright citizenship. And by the way, it's quite patently obvious that it's blatantly unconstitutional for the president to do that, but that's an aside. The case really is about something that has become very controversial, which is the district court judges issuing, in some cases, nationwide injunctions, which basically halt a government policy, not just the one being challenged before them in their district, but the plaintiffs that appear before them, but a halt that would apply nationwide. And depending on what side you are on, whether you're the government or not the government, you may feel quite differently about these nationwide injunctions. Because of course, if you're challenging the administration, you think they're a very important tool to stop a policy that you think isn't just illegal in, say, a district in Texas, but is illegal in every state of the country. And why shouldn't a judge issue a nationwide injunction? Now, if you're a fan of what an administration is doing, you think this tool lends itself to forum shopping, where you go around the country and find the most sympathetic judge you can find, and then you get to stop the policy all across America. So there's a debate about this, and depending on whether you're a fan or a foe of the administration in power, you feel differently about nationwide injunctions. What I think I can say in this instance is the Trump administration very much wants the Supreme Court to knock out in a kind of comprehensive fashion the ability of district court judges to ever issue nationwide injunctions. And it wants that because it wants the litigators, the challenging states, the challenging petitioners to have to chase the administration around from district court to district court around the country. And you've seen the shenanigans the administration has gotten up to, trying to evade orders in one district by literally moving detainees to another jurisdiction and then putting them on planes in the immigration deportation context. So you can see the shenanigans that an administration can get up to if there isn't the possibility of a nationwide tool. It's kind of like having a class action mechanism. And if you have neither class actions nor nationwide injunctions, you can't put a full stop on something that's clearly unlawful. Not to mention, why should there be an injunction in place in one part of the country, but the rest of the country is suffering under something that might be illegal? It seems unfair and uneven somehow. The Supreme Court, certainly there are some justices that really want to do something about the problem of district courts issuing nationwide injunctions. It's a real problem for them. Perhaps a better solution would be a legislative solution from Congress, doing something that would, say, manage these cases. Maybe when something is pending in a few districts, it would all be funneled to the DC Circuit, let's say. There are solutions, but I think the short answer to the question is, if the Trump administration were to get what it wants out of this case, it would make it much harder to challenge their many policies that flout or run very close to crossing the line of legality.
Thank you. The next question, I want to go to both John and
Oh,
Mary.
I'm sorry, Joe, I have to say one more thing. I just have to say this. This concern about forum shopping, that you're going to get some liberal, lunatic, leftist judge, and that's the crazy person stopping your administration, it just doesn't fly here, because so far, the injunctions have been issued by both Democratic and Republican appointed judges in very different jurisdictions. There are scores of them. This is not an instance where it's being abused in the way that people are suggesting.
Great. Thank you. So John and Mary, a question about how we think about the cost of both collecting and making available data, whether it's how we're sort of monitoring existing conditions, or we think about the use, say, of satellite data, John, that you referenced in your opening remarks, et cetera. Help us think through a little bit about the cost of not making these data available to the public, and in particular, the potential costs that may have for young scholars, say doctoral students who are doing research, where we've got a sort of the current graduation of emerging scholars are now facing a research landscape that's fundamentally different than it was, say, when they started graduate school. We'd love to hear your thoughts when you sort of think about the cost of providing less data and less support for this kind of.
Sure. Let me start on that. The costs are clearly high in the form of slowed progress on research, and not just by grad students, but by everybody. Of course, for grad students, it's a particularly severe problem. But the research that is being slowed is research to better understand the pace of increases in climate change impacts, the distribution of those impacts across regions and sectors. And that kind of information is really essential for crafting adaptation strategies, because adaptation has to be tailored to what is happening locally, to the sectors, business, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, that are important in those regions. The costs, of course, are also going to be high in reduced advanced warning of climate-linked extremes, dangerous heat waves, powerful storms, extreme flooding, and so on. And of course, better information about the changing pace of climate change is also useful to tell us how rapidly we need to ramp up mitigation strategies. I would say, though, that because emissions reductions anywhere help everywhere, and because the global climate change is already imposing serious harm very widely, we already really know the right answer to mitigation priority for the short term. What we need to do is ramp up emissions reductions wherever we can as fast as we can.
Thank you, John. Mary.
Yeah, I certainly can add to that, and I can give some examples of how some of these geospatial data from NOAA, for example, through satellites is used in medical research. So I talked a lot about, small scale stuff where you're testing what happens to an individual person, but you can learn a lot from really big data, looking at the population level, at things like weather conditions, wildfire smoke, combustion-related pollution. So the satellite data can actually tell you about the density of particles above a certain spot on the map. So you can estimate exposure to a variety of different health hazards just by knowing where people are located. And so that big data is really important for research and understanding what the health effects are of current exposures, also estimating the future health risks of future exposures, but depending on how the climate changes and how emissions change. It's also important to understand the human vulnerability. So a lot of these data sets that have been taken down or reappeared or at risk of being taken down tell us about how susceptible communities are to different health effects. And that has to do with the general health of the population, things like poverty, access to food, access to green space. There is so much that we have learned from these large public data sets. And it's also played a very important role in driving air quality regulation, because some of the most consistent evidence of mortality from environmental hazards is the data on mortality from particulate matter air pollution, much of which comes from fossil fuel combustion. And a lot of that, you don't have an air quality monitor at every spot on the map. And so you really need that kind of big data to try to estimate what happens across the population.
Can I pick up on something you said, Joe? And what Mary and John are both saying here, and talk about a bigger theme that's underlying all this, which is when you don't have access to science and information, and when long-serving independent experts are cut out of the government policymaking process and replaced by loyalists, when expertise is downgraded and political support or affiliation is upgraded within the government, you have a setup for the erosion of democratic accountability. When you don't have the information to assess what the government may or may not be destroying, when you don't have the research on which to assess whether public health outcomes are getting better or worse, you can't play a role in holding the government accountable. So there's something bigger going on here that is not limited to the climate and energy space, but is happening in a very pronounced way. We're like the canary in a coal mine, because everybody hates environmental regulation. Climate change has become part of the culture war. We're an easy target. We have no friends. And so this is playing out in our context, I think, much more visibly in a way than in other contexts.
Thank you. So, Jody, I want to go back to you on a question that I think I'm going to ask you, I'd love to hear your take, and then I'm going to offer an answer as well.
Okay, I'll be quick.
And it has to do with the endangerment finding, which you brought up
Okay.
in your opening remarks. So
Yeah.
let's suppose that the administration finds a way to either weaken or end the endangerment finding. Do we expect regulated industries to backslide on product improvements that reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Or is there a fear that regulated industries may stall out on making those investments and the world falls further behind on its climate goals?
This is a really important and hard question to answer and to be brief on. I'll try my very best to be quick, Joe, and leave space for others. Just so everyone knows, the endangerment finding is this essential, almost box you have to check in federal law under the Clean Air Act in order to regulate. You just can't set a standard for greenhouse gases if you don't find they're an endangerment to public health and welfare. So if the government decides, well, we don't either believe the science that greenhouse gases are a threat or an endangerment, or we believe that the share of US emissions isn't sufficient to trigger endangerment as a share of total global volume, they could do a number of things to roll back the endangerment finding, or just to say, we're going to look at it again, and meanwhile, no regulation. The consequence of that is there is no legal basis to issue a rule to control CO2 pollution for power plants, a rule to control CO2 pollution from cars and trucks, a rule to produce methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. These are the biggest emitting sectors, highest emitting sectors in the economy. So it's a drastic and dramatic thing to either eliminate or to limit the endangerment finding. Just to let you know, it's the legal move that is the nuclear bomb, okay, in this space. The consequence, I'll let you, Joe, and John, and Mary, if you have comments, talk about consequences. In terms of the private sector, there are market forces that are going to keep rolling forward because there's demand globally for cleaner energy, that is for electric vehicles globally. Now, the US may be slowing down. The US may not be able to compete if we don't have standards helping push in that market direction, and we'll just yield more market share to high producers like China. So that may in fact affect US production and competitiveness. But in other domains, it may be that the market pull is so strong that companies continue to produce cleaner energy alternatives. In the US, we may find ourselves slowed in terms of having more coal take longer to retire as a result of these policies, but that won't slow the rest of the world decarbonizing their grids. I'll stop there.
So I'll make a couple comments and then I'll invite John and Mary if they want to jump in on this to do so as well. One of the lessons I think that at least I took from Trump 1.0, withdrew from the Paris Agreement, stopped the implementation of the Clean Power Plan that had been issued by the Obama administration EPA, in general took a fairly hostile approach to clean energy. And we saw US emissions not go up, a little bit of decline here and there, a little bit of a plateauing. And I think part of that reflects Jody's point, which is that we've already made a lot of investments in using either energy more efficiently in the kinds of technologies and equipment we produce and use, or as well as making significant investments in lowering the cost of zero carbon sources of power. And so as a result, there are these strong, I think, market incentives. There's also the strong incentive that we see for those who are multinational companies to think about the other markets they operate in, where they're going to need to comply with policies that actually support the investment in clean energy. A concern I do have is how, if the US were to get rid of the endangerment finding, how long is the period of time in which we really just don't have statutory authorities at all for this? And how does that affect, say, in a future administration, efforts to either restart climate policy or to re-engage with other countries around the world on climate policy? One example of this is when I was in the government, we worked closely with the government of Canada. This is something actually Jody worked on as well. In fact, Jody was one of our leads crafting what we called the car rule back in 2009 to dramatically improve the fuel economy of vehicles and to reduce the tailpipe emissions of CO2. The Canadians recognize how integrated our auto industry is, how similar our economies are. And they're like, we're just going to use the same rule you have, right? So the thing is that we can talk sometimes about how we can engage with other countries and what we do can give us some leverage to get them to do more. And I think there's something to that. Maybe that's something John could even speak to with respect to how the US engaged China in 2014 and 2015. But in the case of Canada, it showed up immediately in their regulations and what they did in terms of their policy. So there are these concerns about how There are some private market forces that I think keep us in the clean energy space, but I think we start to lose some of the amplifying power that federal policy and actions can have as we engage with partners around the world. John, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, I'd actually like to jump in on a different point, if you don't mind.
Jump in on a different point then.
I could talk about China, but I want to elaborate on a point that Jody made a few moments ago, and that is that the Trump administration's attack on climate science, climate data, climate change mitigation, and adaptation is just a part of a constellation of administration actions and rhetoric that quite clearly is aimed at undermining the roles played by science, evidence, and fact-based analysis in both public understanding and the governance of our society. You think about what those wider ingredients are, they include a chronic pattern of misrepresentation and misdirection by high government officials and their spokespersons, termination of access to tens of thousands of federal databases and informational websites, which has been mentioned, firing inspectors general across federal agencies, criminalizing of speech critical of the administration's policies, threats to defund public radio and television, intimidation of other mainstream media, disparaging judges who've ruled against administration excesses, trying to intervene in the governance of private, never mind public, universities, punishing law firms that have displeased the president, and even attacking museums and libraries. This is a pattern, and it's a very scary one.
John, that was a very long sentence. And it was
Good list.
full of scary things. Mary, let me go to you next, please.
Yeah, sure. I'll take us back to the endangerment finding, and I want to add some health context here. In some ways, the endangerment finding is about health, right? That greenhouse gas emissions put human health and welfare at risk, and therefore the EPA, under the Clean Air Act, can regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And if that authority is lost, not only do we have a major setback in our ability as a country to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but it's going to set us back in terms of interventions that could lead to immediate health benefits for people living today. And I really want to focus on kids. I'm really worried about kids. Their bodies are still developing, right? The decisions that we make today can have lifetime implications for the young people living in this country. And in my own work, I found that kids in the Boston area, where air quality is relatively good, who are close to a busy road, have 3 times the odds of developing asthma than kids who live further away, and who are more because these kids are more highly exposed to traffic-related air pollution, and their lungs also grow more slowly over time, the more heavily they're exposed. And we found that if you reduce those emissions, their lung function grows faster. And so it means that decisions that we make, even in the next few years, can have immediate health benefits for children living today. And so if we aren't able to regulate or roll back standards that were set for motor vehicle emissions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they also reduce harmful pollutants that injure kids' lungs, it's really it's going to really set us back and have real health consequences.
Thank you, Mary. So I apologize that we were not able to address all of the questions that we received. Our time here, as we come to the end of the hour, must come to a close, but our work here at Harvard University and the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability continues. We look forward to continuing to provide insights, evidence, and ideas that will contribute to effective strategies for combating the challenge of climate change. In your work, if you find there to be value in engaging with an expert to help you better understand some of the key characteristics of climate change science, climate change related health, climate change law, or climate change policy, please feel free to reach out directly to any of us. You're also welcome to reach out to our communications colleague, David Trilling at the Salata Institute, who can help match you to the best expert here at Harvard University. Let me extend my appreciation to my colleagues. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mary. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.